Hello and welcome to the Klassiki podcast. I'm your host, Sam Goff. Klassiki is your one-stop shop for the wide world of cinema from Eastern Europe. Subscribers gain access to our library of classic and contemporary films, as well as filmmaker interviews, video introductions, program notes, essays, watchlists, and more. You can sign up for a 7-day free trial today at klassiki.online. 2024 marks 80 years since the release of one of the strangest and most consequential films of all time, Sergei Eisenstein's Ivan the Terrible Part 1. The great avant-garde filmmaker behind the battleship Potemkin had fallen on hard times at the start of the 1940s before receiving an offer he absolutely could not refuse from none other than Stalin himself, to make an epic biopic of Ivan the Terrible, the bloodthirsty 16th century tsar who united the Russian state and who Stalin saw as a historical role model. Eisenstein threw himself into this commission, blending all of his eclectic influences and eccentric theories to produce an expressionistic masterpiece. Of 3 planned installments, Part 1 was a hit with Stalin, but Part 2, in which Ivan succumbs to violent paranoia and the persecution of his subjects, was banned. Eisenstein died while working on the unfinished third film in 1948 at the age of just 50. Today, his incomplete final masterpiece remains a fascinating artifact from the depths of the Stalinist regime. Eisenstein's radical ideas about sexuality and political power seemingly grow ever more vindicated over time, and his treatment of the violence of the Russian state speaks to the present day with grim relevance. To get to the heart of Ivan the Terrible on this anniversary, I spoke with Joe Neuberger, Professor Emerita at the University of Texas, and the author of This Thing of Darkness, Eisenstein's Ivan the Terrible in Stalin's Russia, a comprehensive account of the film's historical and artistic contexts. And the book is coming out in paperback and in Russian next year, and you can find out more by following the links in the show description. Joe Neuberger, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, to start with the most banal question and probably the hardest to answer succinctly, Ivan the Terrible, in all its parts, in all its finished and unfinished parts, why is this film still important, let's say? I was going to ask why is it important, I'll ask why is it still important, and I guess relatedly, why did you decide it was worth dedicating a whole book to?
So let me reverse the order of those questions because I think one leads into the other. There are so many reasons to write a whole book about this one film. First of all, Eisenstein is the most important Soviet director of the first half of the 20th century, if not one of the most important directors in world history. And Ivan the Terrible is his masterpiece. It wasn't always seen that way. He's much more famous for his films of the 1920s, his revolutionary films, Potemkin and October. But he spent the 1920s and 1930s and 40s writing and thinking, and even when he wasn't making films. And Ivan the Terrible is a reflection of all of that work. So actually, that's sort of the second answer, which is that in addition to being one of the greatest filmmakers, he is certainly the most important film theorist of the early 20th century. And again, he's known primarily for his writings in the 20s when he sort of invented radical montage and used it in his early films. But he spent the 30s and 40s developing the idea of montage into a much, much more complex concept and practice. And he was also writing, he was really interested in how people watched films and why people get immersed in films. And this led him to the fields of philosophy and anthropology, all the history of all the arts. And he was writing about all this stuff and thinking about it. And he incorporates a huge amount of that material in this film, which is what makes it a very complex film and really a great masterpiece, even though it wasn't finished, even though only 2 out of 3 parts were actually finished. And the last thing I'll say is that the context, the historical context makes it really important. And again, not really well known. So everyone knows that Stalin commissioned the film in 1941, just as World War II was breaking out, or just a few months before World War II broke out in the Soviet Union. And Stalin this was part of a campaign on Stalin's part to resurrect rulers of the pre-revolutionary period as a kind of pedigree for himself. But it's obviously an odd sort of character because to choose to highlight or revere, because Ivan the Terrible, 16th century ruler, unleashed his own campaign of bloody terror. Stalin was okay with Eisenstein making a film about a bloody ruler, but he expected Eisenstein to justify the violence on the basis of the construction of the great Russian state as a kind of precursor to Stalin's activities as creating the great Soviet state. And Eisenstein didn't do that. He did not make an Orthodox socialist realist film. He made this incredibly complex film that doesn't look like any other film. And in it, he raises questions about not just about Stalinism, but not just Stalinism, but about power in world history, cycles of violence in world history and in Russian history, um, and questions about the nature of Soviet power, the nature of Soviet ideology, of Stalinist ideology. And so no one, before I wrote this book, no one had really looked at all three of those things together. The history of Eisenstein's practice, his practice in this film, reflecting his own studies, and also the historical context in which it took place. And my goal in writing about it was to make this film watched again and really taught again and more widely seen, and to establish it as Eisenstein's masterpiece. And I think my goal then was to do that by showing the ways in which all of Eisenstein's thinking and practice and the historical context come together. So why is it still worth watching? Yeah, that's the whole point of the book. It is still worth
You'll have
watching.
to you have to buy and read the book to find out.
Absolutely, yes. It is a film like no other film. Up until that point, it's been, of course, copied and extremely influential since then. But it doesn't look like any other film. So it's interesting from a formal point of view. And then it's extremely important from the point of view, just look around us today at
Mm.
individual rulers who have gone out of their way to destroy their enemies in order to maintain individual rule, concentrated, centralized rule. And then the terrible consequences of that.
Yeah, it's like it's one of those films, I guess, like many great kind of works of art, that it seems to mold itself to fit whichever circumstances it's viewed in. And obviously, in 2024, when we think about Russia and the Russian Empire, Russian imperialism, the Russian state, obviously we are forced to think about things with a certain perspective. But this film more than lends itself to the current climate. I think we'll come back to that
Okay,
later, maybe.
yeah, for
I
sure.
think, like you say, that historical context is so important. The kind of the central image of this great filmmaker being summoned by Stalin himself to create this film, and the tightrope that Eisenstein had to walk as a result of that is obviously incredibly compelling, just from a kind of a standpoint of personal drama or psychology. But the broader circumstances that Eisenstein was working in, I think, are important to understand as well, right? So that's obviously the context of the Second World War and what that did to the Soviet film industry, and also what had been happening to Eisenstein in the previous kind of decade, shall we say. So again, it's hard to summarize briefly, but what do you think it's important for people to understand about what happened to Eisenstein in the 1930s,
Mhm.
um, and how that led to the Ivan the Terrible project?
Sure. So the 1930s were a very tumultuous period for Eisenstein. Um, After he had become world famous after producing Potemkin, which went on to be shown around, well, world famous in the sense of Europe and the United States. Um, in the 20s with Potemkin and then with October. And these were films that dramatized revolutionary events. They were especially important in leftist Europe and the United States, but also from a formal point of view. And so in the late 20s, he went on a long tour of Europe and the United States and ultimately Mexico. And he spent more than a year in Mexico shooting a film that was supposed to be a huge panoramic history of Mexican culture that also incorporated a lot of his new ideas about anthropology, about human development, about perception, about nature, all sorts of things. Um, but he was never able to edit or finish the film on Mexico because Stalin recalled him to the Soviet Union under threat. And Upton Sinclair, who the socialist American um, had been funding the film, kept the footage in the United States, promised to send it to Eisenstein, but he never did. This was a huge tragedy for Eisenstein. He had invested his heart and soul in the film, a whole year of his work in the film, and he was never able to finish this. And to give you one detail, he kept the postcard that Upton Sinclair had sent him, telling him that he was going to return the footage to him. Eisenstein kept that like on his, I don't know if he had a bulletin board on above his desk for the rest of his life. But back in Moscow, things had changed from, during the time that he was away. And under Stalin's leadership, state control of all the arts had become more powerful. There was a policy shift in filmmaking from avant-garde films to popular films. And the head of the film industry did not love Eisenstein and did not allow him to make many films. So he felt out of place. He was out of place. He went for many years without producing a film. When he finally did, it was the height of the Stalinist terror in 1937. The film Bieschen Meadow was banned. They held a 2-day conference in Moscow to talk about banning it, talk about everything that was wrong with it. Eisenstein was forced to give a kind of public apology.
Never a
But
good
he did it.
sign when they have
Sorry.
to. Never a good sign when they have to hold a conference about how you've messed up.
Right. Not at all a good sign. And of course, this was 1937, so everyone expected that Eisenstein's life was in danger.
Right. Yeah.
And many, many of his friends, of course, were, and that hundreds of thousands of other people lost their lives during this period. But he somehow escaped. Stalin somehow believed that he could still be depended upon to make the kinds of films that Stalin and the Stalinist arts communities wanted. And so actually the Politburo voted on it and they decided to give Eisenstein another chance. He made a film that's when he made Alexander Nevsky, probably his most popular film, very much more simple film from the point of view of um, both narrative structure and politics. It's about a single ruler coming to power to defend Russia from German invaders. That was finished in 1938, 9, and it Stalin liked it, everyone liked it, but that won Eisenstein a lot of uh, security.
Hmm.
And but then he went through another period where his films were not made. He got as far as scouting locations for a film about Central Asia, etc. And then in January 1941, Einstein was really frustrated. He sent a message to Stalin saying, "Come on, I want to make this film. Let me make this film." And he got a phone call from Zhdanov, Andrei Zhdanov, who was the head of cinematography, basically, at that time. And he said, "No, we don't want you to make that film. We want you to make a film about Ivan the Terrible." So that's how
That's
he
the
ended up doing
story.
that. It was one of many films or artworks about Ivan the Terrible that Stalin wanted. I think I said this earlier. But it's the only one that's really stood the test of time. It's a very tricky subject for the reasons I stated earlier.
Hmm. And of course, he makes it under these conditions of evacuation. The film industry had been shunted off to Central Asia to kind of evade the war, the Nazi invasion,
Right,
um, and
right,
he puts together this team that includes a lot of returning collaborators like Prokofiev, the composer, but also some new figures, a new cinematographer, very importantly, and new acting talent as well. So he assembles this team in Kazakhstan. Am I right? They were shooting in
yes, in
Kazakhstan,
Almaty,
in
now
Almaty.
Almaty, yeah.
Yeah. So with this team, he goes about creating something, and like you said, nothing looks like this film. Let's get into that. What does this film look and sound like?
Yeah. Eisenstein started out making, with his longtime cinematographer, Edward Tissé. Tissé had been the cinematographer on every film before that. He'd gone to Europe and the US and Mexico with him. Um, but he also came into contact there with Andrei Moskvin, who was a Leningrad cinematographer, the other sort of greatest cinematographer of the period. But one of the things about being in evacuation, which he hated for most for the conditions there, he was far from Moscow, from his friends, from his books, but he was also far from the intruding eyes of
Hmm.
the state, culture surveillance. And so he felt free, this is my theory, he felt free to make the kind of film that he wanted to make. And also make it as slowly as he wanted to make it, and with the people that he wanted to work with. Tissot tried to talk him out of it, um, and it's clear that it was very painful for Eisenstein to sideline this longtime collaborator who basically taught him how to make movies. But he and Moskvin immediately had a kind of common language. They were seen walking around the city, talking to each other, obviously very friendly and animated. So these were very difficult conditions. Eisenstein and Prokofiev, for example, lived in this building for art elite artists. But most of the cast and crew lived in big dormitories that were badly heated in the winter and I mean, it was just the summer was miserable, and without really sufficient food. Things were very difficult in Almaty. And in fact, they filmed at night because during the day the power for the little amount of power that they had was devoted to munitions factories and other factories in the city. In fact, Almaty only got electricity in the early 30s. So, and this is the early 40s, if you want to think about it in those terms. It's quite remarkable that they were able to shift the entire Moscow film studio here, Moscow and Leningrad film studios here, and that they were making films. Yeah, so conditions were tough. Now, in terms of the look and the feel of the film and what this group of collaborators put together, yeah, this film doesn't look like any other film. It is sometimes compared to silent films and to avant-garde films, but it's also clear that Eisenstein wasn't just trying to recreate the 1920s, but he was trying to put into practice everything he had learned since then. And so, how is it different? The storytelling is not linear. The space is configured very ambiguously. Sometimes you're not quite sure where you are. Little doorway, I mean, it's famous for the little doorways that everyone has to like bend down to go through. Chikasov was very tall, by the way, so he that looks particularly dramatic. They're very spare. The sets are very spare. There are only enough objects to that have symbolic purposes, all have some role in the narrative as well. The acting is very strange. There's one scene where I think Cherkasov, it's like a couple minute scene, acts in a dozen different genres. Every movement is a kind of different genre, and he's so talented that he can kind of pull this off and look like someone who is coming apart at the seams, and yet have a kind of unity of character to that. And that's one of the things
Hmm.
that Eisenstein's particularly interested in.
I think what always strikes me is like you say, these sets are quite spare, but they are at the same time, it's paradoxical. They feel very expansive and incredibly claustrophobic.
Yeah.
It's this sense of imperial courtly grandeur combined with this very confining, tight, dark chiaroscuro spaces, and the shadows are famously so
Yeah,
evocative and
absolutely.
important.
Yeah, I mean, Eisenstein loved contradiction. He was a sort of generally dialectical thinker. So again, just like I was saying about the acting, lots of contradictions and things falling apart at the seams, but then coming together in various moments of unity or revelation or something like that. Well, oh, no, another really good example that I love, that I particularly love, are the icons that are on the walls all around Yvonne's palace, right? And they have themes that relate to everything going on in the plot. So, for example, in the
It's like a
palace, there's
commentary on what's happening in front of
both
you.
both a commentary, so like, but he also uses icons to suggest plot development. So one of the things he says in his notebooks is that he wanted the icons to be large and threatening and colossal to give the impression of how they felt to Yvonne when he was a child. And then those feelings, when those icons are shown again later on, we see Yvonne sort of circle back to his feelings as an abandoned child whose mother was killed by boyars. And he's filled with a kind of need for or desire for revenge against those same boyars. And that raises the question of what Ivan is doing, right? Is he carrying out the creation of the great Russian state, or is he just carrying out personal revenge?
My experience of watching this with other people who haven't seen it before is often
Yeah.
that they don't quite know how to react the first time they see it, because even just on the level of tone, I mean, as you're saying, these are incredibly complex conceptual
Yeah.
patterns that Eisenstein's weaving, but just on the surface level of tone, from one second to the next, it's incredibly funny, incredibly disturbing, serious, heightened emotions, base emotions. It's really quite hard to grasp. I've seen so many times people not quite knowing if they're supposed to be laughing or not. You know, we're familiar with that sensation watching films sometimes, and I think that corresponds to what you're saying. It's a film that you need to marinate in, I think, for a while before you can really start to pick apart all of the threads.
Yeah, one of the reasons that this is such a complex film or a hard film to understand is that the narrative is structured around questions. Eisenstein's asking how a innocent, vulnerable child can become a bloody dictator. And he's asking, when are we responsible for our actions and when can we blame circumstances? And one of the big questions is, when is killing justified in political terms, right? So many people see Eisenstein's answers to these questions to be ambiguous. That is, they think Eisenstein was saying that Ivan was a great ruler, even if he engaged in some of these activities, but I disagree with that. I think that he is exploring here the question of how anyone becomes a dictator, and how people all over the world in world history have suffered under centralized rule.
I think that gets us a little more towards the present day. I think we've talked a lot about the kind of circumstances, the context behind the film, and the very intense, particular and intense conditions that Eisenstein was working under. So now let's take a step back and think about how to approach the film today, 80 years on, as we were saying. So I guess you've already answered this question a little bit there, but maybe we can get into it in a bit more detail. Is there a political philosophy behind the film? You say that it's ambiguous, but is there a kind of philosophy of kind of violence or tyranny? Because you write in the book that Eisenstein wanted to kind of to show how societies kind of change over time to become tyrannies.
I really believe that there is, and as I was just saying, I think that he that Eisenstein believed that he had something to say about tyranny and about politics generally, but also about in his own time. And so here, these questions that he was raising about politics are also joined by a whole set of questions about individuals. Um, what does it mean when individual rulers are motivated by feelings rather than reason and logic? And also, what does it mean, as in Stalinist Russia, when when people are being asked to love their ruler like a father? What does it
Mm.
mean when what is the underlying feeling in all male institutions, for example? Here I'd just like to say that he had very strong feelings about balance, right? So he believed that people were not that they were necessarily non-binary in contemporary terms, but that what he called bisexual. And he felt that everybody has some aspect of both female and male uh, elements. But he wrote in these notebooks, in his notebook for his sort of written masterpiece Method, which was never published in his lifetime. He connected what's going on in the film specifically with the Soviet Politburo, which was an all-male institution. And he felt that this was really unbalanced, and that lack of balance is dangerous for society. He thought when women become too much like men, and lose that balance of sort of female male being of bisexuality, that's also dangerous. So we see this in the character of Yefrosinia,
Mm.
Eisenstein's aunt, and her son, Vladimir, who is the opposite, right? He's a very effeminate man.
I think those questions of gender and sexuality are another way in which the film watched in the 21st century really resonates again, because as you were starting to get into there, Eisenstein had a lot to say about sexuality and gender. Some of it we might raise our eyebrows a little, but he was a very serious thinker about this stuff. I mean, we could get into his personal history, how he arrived at these strange and explicit ideas. But watching the film now, it's very striking the way he understands gender and sexuality as performative, I guess would be the theoretical term people would use now. You mentioned the kind of villainous female character of Yefrosinia, who to my British eyes, she's like a panto crone. She's like a drag queen character. That's how she reads now. And there's so much going on there with homoeroticism and so on. So, what are some of the ways, I guess, that Eisenstein prefigures our more contemporary ideas about gender and sexuality?
In his own private life and in his drawings in particular and in his writings, he didn't shy away from any sexuality, like
The
especially in
drawings
his,
are remarkable.
yeah, he has thousands of drawings with sexual themes. And it's hard it, it's hard to imagine any form of sexual encounter that he ignored, because he drew pictures of really everything. And I think that's, a kind of key to understanding Eisenstein, his own psyche, that he was willing to push himself to think about and sort of feel in his own body, even if he didn't experience it sexually, the very extremes of human nature, the extremes of human desire, but also of everything else. And for him, it was those extremes that are revealing about who we are. As far as performativity goes, he absolutely connected the performativity of ritual behavior in the palace with contemporary society. So many of these scenes replicate the kind of everyday performativity of socialist realism, of the Stalinist court. So, the most obvious, there are a couple of really obvious cases when at the very beginning of part two, when Andrei Kurbsky, who is a traitor to the Ivan's court, and goes and pledges fealty to the Polish court of Sigismund II. He does this in a explicitly sexual
Yeah.
way. He's on his knees looking up at Sigismund, who's standing like right there in front of him. It's almost like we can see a parody of sex there. Very hard for contemporary audiences to miss. Much easier for earlier audiences to miss. But I also believe that this was one of the things that made Stalin so angry about part two, that he did
Yeah.
not miss the homoeroticism of part two and was very angry about the way in which he felt it demeaned the court.
And of
Um,
course, part two ends or kind of climaxes with this remarkable sequence in color, which is a kind of drunken feast, which is explicitly about dressing up in other people's clothing. But it's a complicated murder plot involving making someone else wear someone else's clothes so that
mhm.
they'll get assassinated in someone else's place. That's a little by the by, but the whole thing is this kind of riotous, drunken, phantasmagoric cavalcade of all these male bodies and drunkenness and yeah, kind of dress up and drag and so on. It's hard to imagine that that would have gone down well in the Kremlin. The
They
thing,
actually all, are dancing and then they all fall down on top of each other with
yeah,
Fyodor Basmanov dressed in drag standing above them. And in fact, it looks like it's almost about to become a rape scene, a performance of a rape scene. They're starting to undress him. It's an absolutely amazing finale for the film. And it's one of the great scenes in world cinema.
and they were able to shoot that scene in color. Just a bit of trivia because the Red Army had sacked a bunch of color stock from German film
Right.
studios during the war,
Yeah.
and this is my awkward segue away from the sexuality question into the question that I really think we have to think about hard when we're watching it now, which is this question of Russian militarism, imperialism. The film is, as you've said, the film is explicitly about this kind of process of centralization and state formation. And the first part of the film depicts kind of Ivan's first great triumph after coming to the throne is his conquering of Kazan, which was a Tatar, capital. It wasn't part of Russia at that time, and it's this conquering of this ethnic, this racial, religious other. So again, this is a very broad question, and I'm sure with Eisenstein the answer is always ambiguous. But how do we think about this film in light of the war in Ukraine, among other kind of Russian aggressions in the 21st century?
Yeah, it's not an easy question to answer, but I think it's a really important question. And I think I would have a lot more to say about it if Eisenstein had managed to make part three, which was
Right. Yeah.
about which was almost entirely about a military campaign, in which he leaves not a single soul alive, not even the birds, in Novgorod before marching to the Baltic. So those imbalances that have been building throughout parts one and two seem at this point in part three to have produced this excessive and unnecessary violence, very familiar to um, what the Russian invasion of Ukraine appears to us today, to me anyway, today. So on the one hand, Ivan the Terrible, the three parts of Ivan Terrible are about Russia expanding, beginning its empire in the east with its conquest of Kazan, and expanding its empire to the west with the conquest of the Baltic, but with ambiguous sort of consequences, right?
Hmm.
But I think that we might have seen more imperial scenes along the lines of Alexander Nevsky if he had finished the film. I think it would be easier to answer the question. But I've actually written about Alexander Nevsky in these terms because I was watching it right after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it seemed to me that there were a lot of themes in that movie that carry over into Ivan, but that were much more explicit in Alexander Nevsky, if I can talk about that for a minute.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
so Nevsky's war is constructed in that film as an entirely defensive one. Germany's
Right.
invaded, Russia fights back. But one of the things we know about warfare is that even defensive wars, and this is very much part of military science and writing in military studies today, that defensive wars very, very rarely remain defensive, and that if it's at all possible, they become wars of aggression and imperialism. And there are hints of this in Alexander Nevsky, especially at the end when he's kind of speaking contradictorily. On the one hand, there's this whole speech where he says, whoever raises a sword to us, we will fight back.
Mm.
Um, but it's said in such an aggressive way, and it's filmed in such an aggressive way that it suggests that they would not stop at a defensive war. That's my reading of it. But there's also very strong theme in the film of the prey becoming the predator. And that is one of Eisenstein's themes. One of the themes that he's most interested in is the way that vulnerable, innocent children like little Ivan become predators like adult Ivan. And that's one of the he played that theme plays out in many different ways in Ivan the Terrible. So this whole idea of the prey becoming the predator is something that I think is part of the story of the rise of an individual ruler with too much power.
Yeah.
Um, and that so in that sense, it's a bit of a stretch, but it is I think gives us some, I don't know if it gives us some insight into Putin's um, absolutely unnecessary, violent, destructive invasion of Ukraine. But it's certainly, the sort of power that he wields now. It's certainly what Eisenstein was trying to warn against, I believe.
Mm. Well, even absent this question of a, a dictatorial figure like Putin, right? I mean, I think in what you're saying there, and in that lesson from Alexander Nevsky, there is this idea. Ivan the Terrible is a film about the formation of this Russian state, this Soviet state, allegorically. But there's this contained within it. There is this idea that that formation will involve violence, and that violence is not containable within these
Right.
within these vessels
Mhm.
that it's apportioned to, and that it will necessarily, as you say, spill out and seek new avenues and new opportunities. So
Mhm.
even if we can't exactly kind of compare Putin and Stalin and Ivan the Terrible, this or that other despotic ruler, there is nonetheless this idea about violence that is timely.
Yeah, and that's exactly the point, actually, I think that Eisenstein's trying to make by bringing personal ideas of vengeance together with political ideas of power, because vengeance is in something that begets more vengeance, right? More violence, right? It is a ongoing cycle, and it is unstoppable, basically. And if you look at the speeches that Putin was making, it's really clear that this is to some extent a war of vengeance against Ukraine for having abandoned the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, the rightful place that Russians think it should have had, which is as the little brother of Russia's, right? So this is also a war of anger, of revenge, rather than just idea of unification or whatever. We don't.
Like you say, without the kind of completion of the film, and this is the kind of the great tragedy of Eisenstein, is that his great creative apotheosis was left unfinished, and is so bound up with his death.
Yeah, that's true. Although some people think that if he had made part three, he would certainly have not survived. But he died at age 50. I mean, it's amazing. Just at the height of his powers. I mean, this is an amazing masterpiece. And his writing at the time, which is just really beginning to be appreciated, is really puts him in the place in the same company as the great thinkers of the mid 20th century.
Well, I think with Eisenstein, he's going to be surprising us after we're all long gone. I think he's that. He's that kind of artist. He's that kind of thinker. And I think
Yeah.
before we follow him down all of his different rabbit holes, I think we'd better leave that there for now. But Joe Nubo, thanks so much for taking us through the history of Ivan the Terrible and Eisenstein and everything in between. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much for inviting me to talk about this great film that I love.